Hey there, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about finding and recruiting study participants, why it's really important, and it is sometimes easily underestimated in the life of a clinical research coordinator how important recruitment is. Now, that being said, I will tell you that there are some clinical research sites that do have dedicated recruiters, but I'm going to talk to you today from the assumption that there is not a recruiter and that you are going to be the coordinator doing the recruiter. So here we go. Why is it important? Oh my goodness. If you are able to successfully recruit within the timelines given to you, that means your sponsor gets a competitive edge from a business perspective. So I wanted to lay this out right away up front so you'll really get to understand why this is so important, because it would be very easy to sort of misunderstand your sponsor when they get very concerned about your recruitment not going fast enough. So if you go sort of backwards and figure out why this is important to them, you can understand why it's going to, by virtue of that, be important to you. So the finances of recruitment then sort of gets a little more meat into why this has such an impact. In 2015, $148 billion was spent globally in drug development. That is a lot of cash. From that, about $2.6 billion is the average cost to develop one new medication that receives FDA approval in the first 10 years, in the first decade of this century. And that takes into consideration all of the drugs that are not successful. So when I say an average of $2.6 billion, that includes the expenses associated with drug failures. And of that, about 25% of development costs are spent on patient recruitment or affected by patient recruitment. So even if it's not a direct expense related to finding and recruiting patients, this can be an expense that's incurred because recruitment's not done in a timely manner. So that is a lot of cash that we're talking about, and this is why it's important to your sponsors. So the business impact, over 75% of all clinical trials fail to meet their recruitment deadlines. Now, I'm not talking about just one single study site. I'm talking about in the life of the development of one drug. So you might have some trials that meet the requirements, but overall, we're going to say about 75% of the trials fail to meet their deadlines. For every day of delayed approval, it's estimated up to $8 million in sales opportunity is lost. So not every drug's making $8 million a day, but over the course of that patent, every day that's lost is said to cost about $8 million. So now you really have a better idea of why this is important. So every day that a clinical trial is extended, that's one less day that before it gets to the FDA for approval. So this can be a lot of money. The length of delay is going to vary based on phase. So it's estimated that phase 1 trials last 42% longer than planned. Phase 2 trials last 31% longer than planned on average. And phase 3 trials can take up to 30% longer than planned. So from this you can see that we've really got easily in the mid 30% extension on what the expectation is. So how do we estimate recruitment? The only thing you can do as a clinical research coordinator is be honest and estimate recruitment at your site. Some key elements there are 3 key elements you have to really seriously think about when you are estimating how long it will take you to enroll the number of participants that are needed. And the first one is protocol feasibility, and we've already talked about that. The more complex and the more difficult the protocol, the more time it's going to take you probably to find participants. For example, if you had a clinical trial that was of a daily oral drug, that might be sort of easy to accrue, and that would be, the feasibility would be very good. If you then, on the other hand, had a potential clinical trial that involved 1 week of hospital inpatient drug administration, 1 week every month, you would have a little more difficulty finding patients who would be interested in participating on that. So that feasibility is really going to impact how easy it is for you to find patients. The patient yield, which we'll talk about in a minute, so really how many patients are you going to be able to find with the disease under study? And then how long do you have to find those participants. If it's a multi-center trial, so there are investigators across the country doing this trial, for example, a phase 3 study, then it is helpful to know how long do you have to recruit. Not all of the clinical research sites are started at the same time. So a sponsor might decide that they need 20 research sites. And they find that 5 of the research sites are really under recruiting, and they just don't have enough patients to get the study done. The sponsor might decide to add in 5 more research sites sort of late in the game to make up for the 5 underperforming sites. So that gets to be a discussion you have with the sponsor. How much time do I have reasonably to be able to recruit participants? You have an advantage if you're one of the early sites. Definitely you have more time. But those are good questions to ask, because all of these things are going to impact how you're going to be able to find patients. So here's what I call the American Idol model. If you remember American Idol, right? They would start with, going across the country, and thousands of people would come out for the show. So this is the site enrollment path according to that American Idol model. Here's how it works. We're going to start with potential patients, and then we're going to work through the initial contact with them, and then screen failures, last minute changes, and things like that. So this is how it works. You have 100 patients for the medical condition under study. So this is an asthma study of adult females, ages 18 to 80. Your investigator says, we have a lot of those patients. We see zillions of those patients, right? So your investigator tells the sponsor, we have at least 100 patients who'll be fine for that. So the sponsor says, great, you've got 100 patients, that's amazing. Deep down, this doesn't mean you're going to have 100 patients that go on the study. So you have 100 patients. You start with 100. And then those 100 patients that look like they would be good, you contact them either by letter or email or phone, and you contact these 100 patients, and 40 of them say, that sounds like something I might be interested in doing. That's already a serious drop. And by the way, I'm making these estimates based on my personal experience because I used to track this and to really get a handle on it, because I would have a lot of very hard discussions with my investigators about their realistic estimation of how many patients we had. So now the pool of 100 is 40. You've already lost 60 people right up front. Your investigator does not really recognize this because you're the one doing it, not your investigator. Okay, so I have 40. I'm like, oh, this isn't good. But 40 is still good. All right, out of those 40, some of them are not going to be eligible for medical reasons. So even though that these are women with asthma who are adults, and those are the people I'm looking for this study, we've got some that just aren't going to be eligible for medical reasons. They might be pregnant, and pregnancy is an exclusion, so some things like that. Now I have 25. I've lost 3/4 of my estimated potential patients already. And this is not unusual. This is actually going to be about dead on for a lot of studies. So now I've scheduled those 25 to come in and be consented. So some of them just won't show up for the consent. They'll be like, nah, changed my mind. They might call you and tell you they're not coming. They might just not show up. And of those that actually sign the consent form, some of them might change their mind at the last minute and say, I'm not interested. I've changed my mind. My husband doesn't want me to be on a clinical trial. He's scared. So now I'm down to 17. Oh my gosh, I've lost 83% of my pool. This is crazy. Now I'm really worried. Of those 17 I actually enroll in this study, some of them will fail to become what we call evaluable. So your protocol is going to include landmarks in it in which the patients yield enough data where we would consider them to be evaluable. So in some studies it might be they have to stay on study 1 month, it might be 2 months, it might be 3 months, but your protocol will write very clearly what endpoints those patients have to participate in order for them to generate enough data. So out of those 17, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 that are not evaluable. And when I say they're not evaluable, then even though they were enrolled in the trial, your sponsor is going to want them replaced. So now you've got more work to do. This is a very realistic kind of scenario of what will happen on a clinical trial. The problem is oftentimes investigators don't see the back end that you know. So this is my American Idol model. I can also, if you like to sort of visualize it different, oh yeah, so I said 12. So if you also want to visualize it a little bit differently, then it's a funnel, right? You've got all these potential patients, you're going to have screen failures and last minute changes, and then at the bottom of the funnel you put 100 patients in, you get 12 out. So what regulations affect in recruitment? It would be awesome. We don't have one single regulation which covers recruitment. 50.25, talking about the informed consent process. ICH guideline for good clinical practice includes language about recruiting. The FDA has information sheets which they have available online which talk about recruiting. And if you're lucky enough to work in the EU, there is a clinical trials directive which talks about recruitment. And by the way, I've always wanted to work in the EU. So if you get a job as a coordinator in the EU, give me a call and look me up, because maybe I'd like to live in Switzerland maybe for a little while. So how do you find participants? Now you know why you need them. You know what's going to happen when you find them. Where are they? Because now you're like, okay, I get it, but I can't just, where do you find them? The most common place I do think is the investigator's clinic or practice. If you work with an investigator who's in a private practice. The investigator's already said, hey, I have 100 adult female patients with asthma. So the investigator's already knowing to look for these patients. The investigator is also working in a professional network of other physicians, and sometimes physicians will refer into that investigator for the clinical trial. Advertisements, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Clinical trials registries are also another great place to reach out to a very broad audience for them to find you. So with the investigator's practice, the physician's referrals, and advertisements, you are really looking for the participants. But the trial registries are a really great way to say to the world, look, we have these clinical trials and you can come and find us. So there's government-based. The most well-known is clinicaltrials.gov. And you can go to that website and you can find clinical trials. You can find clinical trials in San Antonio. You can find clinical trials by disease type. You can find them by investigator, all sorts of things. So it's a government-based, and clinicaltrials.gov is huge. You can then, as a research site, pay a fee and go on a registry that's going to cost you. So centerwatch.com is it's a very big site, but you're going to have to pay a fee to put your trial there. There's nothing wrong with that if you think it's going to help you. And then sometimes sponsors will have their own registry. So if now this is for a person in the community, they would have to know to go to lilytrials.com to find a trial that is sponsored by Eli Lilly. But it's someplace, and your sponsor will take care of that. It's still, it's going to take many different avenues to find participants. Professional recruiting agencies also exist, and these are agencies that they exclusively work to find clinical trials participants. If you decide to go this route, they're expensive. So this is definitely something to negotiate with your sponsor when you are negotiating the contract. And this is going to be something that only gets used if you have an extremely complex trial where the feasibility is very difficult and you already know that you're going to have trouble finding participants because they are expensive. Patient advocacy groups are wonderful places to find clinical trial participants. In San Antonio, in Austin, there's a very large breast cancer advocacy group, and they're very strong in the community, and they can be a wonderful resource. So when you go and talk to an advocacy group and say, here's the disease that we want to study, you're an advocacy group for this disease, can we get together and talk? And can you share this information with people that come to your advocacy group? And they can be wonderful sources. And then social networking sites. Oh my goodness, this has really taken off. So you can use any social media, and it's amazing. I all the places you can find clinical trials. You not only Facebook and some obvious places like that, but you can also find clinical trials on Pinterest, which is amazing, and Instagram and Craigslist. And if you can think of a site, there's probably people looking for clinical trial participants on that site. So don't underestimate the social networking as well. All right, so one of the things I said was you could advertise for patients. This is an old standby, right? You might have already seen advertisements now on daytime TV. Your IRB has to approve all of your direct advertising. So bear that in mind when you're getting your study started, if there's going to be advertisement, that you want to include that when you send all of your documents to the IRB to review your clinical trial. The IRB is going to want to look at the materials, right? Is it a flyer? Is it a brochure? They don't want to just know that you're advertising. They want to know what the advertisement's like, because they're going to look at it from the eyes of the participant. The IRB just wants to make sure that you're not tricking anybody, right? That you are taking, your approach is fair and honest, because the IRB wants to know that the rights and welfare of those participants is safeguarded. So they want to know what the materials are, the methods. So are you going to put this on TV? Are you going to hang this flyer up in a college setting? They're going to want to look at those methods just as if that participant was seeing it. And then they're going to want to know the audience, right? I'm looking for adult females with asthma in my example. Where are you, what is the language like for that audience? This gets to be especially important if you are advertising for a pediatric trial, because your audience is going to be children and parents. So the IRB is going to ask you all of these questions to make sure, again, that you're being honest and above board for your participants. So internet advertisements have some special language for them. The internet listing may be excluded from IRB approval if, and this is the exception to the rule, the listing is very limited in nature, the study title, the contact information, that kind of stuff. Again, go look at the clinicaltrials.gov and you'll see exactly what I mean by very limited in nature. And both of these things have to be met. It's exclusively distributed on the website. So if you want to have your listing put on the web exactly as the way it is going to be in flyers or mailing, then that won't work. The IRB will have to approve it. But if you want to put it in very limited nature and keep it the way it's done just on the website, then that's okay. And honestly though, most people will still ask the IRB for approval of this, because you'll come to find that you want to make sure that you're doing everything with IRB approval. So oftentimes people will ask the IRB for approval even if it's not technically required, just to be on the safe side. So now let's talk about recruiting versus informing. Two different things, and the regulations are going to treat them differently. So IRB, I mentioned, has to approve anything that's used to encourage participants to contact you about a trial, right? The radio advertisements, the TV advertisements, the mailings, all those things, right? So think of it this way. Anything that's widely distributed requires IRB approval. So anything that you're going to send out to the community, right, that's intended for a very wide audience, you need IRB approval. The IRB does not need to approve the exchange of clinical information. This is a little bit different, and there is a distinguishing difference. Think of it this way. Individual exchange of information does not need approval. So you're going to send a flyer, you're going to mail a flyer to all your adult female asthma patients. That's going to get IRB approval. Then when those people contact you to say, I would think I'm interested in this trial, that exchange of information does not require approval. And think about it, it is a very practical kind of consideration. There is no way you can anticipate how that conversation is going to go and how you're going to explain things to the clinical trial participant, because everybody's an individual and those conversations will be very individualized. So the IRB does not need to approve how that conversation is going to happen. The very widely distributed stuff does require it. The individual conversation does not. This is important because honestly, sometimes monitors from the sponsor might not understand this little nuance difference. So I want you to understand the difference. You cannot get IRB approval on conversations. All right, now let's talk about compensating people. Honestly, that's my first question. I sort of act as a secret shopper, and I put my name out there in the community to say I'm interested in clinical trials. I've not participated in a clinical trial recently, or actually ever. I've only done educational trials, but I'm always curious to see how that goes. And my first question is always, what are you going to pay me, right? So compensation is important. Compensation, however, you have to explain to participants it's not a benefit. It is strictly an incentive. So don't trick them into thinking this is a benefit. We don't know what the benefit will be for participating in a clinical trial, but we can definitely tell you that we're incentivizing you with compensation of some type. The compensation requires IRB approval. And it doesn't matter what form of incentive you use, you still need IRB approval. If you're giving cash, IRB approval. If you're giving movie tickets, IRB approval. If you are giving gift certificates, IRB approval. Whatever it is, it requires IRB approval. Most of the time, the IRB is going to be more interested in knowing what is your schedule of payment as opposed to knowing how much you're paying. And this is sort of interesting when you think about it, because you would think up front, am I paying too little, am I paying too much? And the IRB doesn't really have a method for determining that so much as they're going to look at the schedule of payments. Now, it wouldn't make sense, on a practical note, for you as the coordinator to pay someone who's going to stay on trial for 2 months. It wouldn't make any sense for you to pay them all of their incentive up front, right? Because why are they going to come back? So you want to, in some way, use that incentive to keep them on trial. So the logical opposite would make sense. Well, I'm going to give them all of their compensation then at the end of those 2 months. And the IRB is not going to like that either. The IRB is going to want some type of reasonable payments at scheduled intervals. And here's why. For you, if you do it up front, your participants might just disappear. On the other hand, if you do it at the end, you will have people stay on study perhaps when they would like to withdraw consent, right? If you're going to give me $1,000 in 2 months, I probably will put up with a lot of garbage for 2 months to get to my $1,000. So I might want to withdraw my consent. I'm not going to do that, right? So now I'm creating sort of some duress. Also, if I have an adverse event that might withdraw me from the study because I'm too sick, I might lie and not tell you about that. So it creates a very unfortunate kind of, you are incentivizing someone, but you're incentivizing them too much. So the IRB is going to say, can you make the payments on some type of landmark? Up front, maybe at week 2, week 6, and week 8. So something like that is going to be more interesting to the IRB than so much how much you're going to give them. And then the IRB is going to sort of consider community standards. They're going to see a lot of compensation that comes through as they review and approve studies. So they're going to sort of have an idea of what's reasonable in the community. Community standards are going to be different, right? Just based on cost of living and things like that. So what compensation's like in San Francisco or Honolulu is going to be different than compensation in Bismarck, North Dakota or San Antonio. So the community standards are going to be sort of considered by the IRB. So you're not going to find compensation that's standard across the country. Now we can also talk about, okay, we're going to incentivize participants to come on the study. Can we incentivize healthcare providers? And this is a really interesting concept. You have 2 ways you could do this. You could give bonus payments, the sponsor could give bonus payments to investigators to enhance enrollment. And I have seen that happen. Personally, I find it offensive. I do my very best to recruit and enroll participants without the lure of a bonus, because I'm professional and I want to do a good job. So sometimes sponsors will try to incentivize investigators by offering them a bonus. Sometimes investigators will pay other professionals, presumably other physicians, to encourage them to find study subjects. So almost like a headhunter fee. You know, I'll give you X amount of dollars for every study subject that you send to me that I'm able to enroll. Whether these payments can take place varies by state law. So I will tell you, for nurses, for example, in Texas, I cannot take more than $50 as a bonus payment. So, that's no money at all from a sponsor and that kind of thing. I'm never going to take a tip from a patient. The American Medical Association says referral payments for research, those are unethical. So the AMA has a statement that says don't do it. Honestly, I've not ever really seen this happen, but I want you to consider that there can be healthcare provider incentives. As always, references, including Karen Wood. Make sure you read this chapter. And I love to talk about this stuff, so please let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon. Take care.